Just let me know.
No, I can't say I've seen that, James. I do not really like Disrupt. I've watched a lot of their stuff. I think they jump from topic to topic in the same video, and it makes it convoluted and hard to follow. It's awfully pretentious. Their visuals are really cool, but I don't think they tell the stories very well. Exit Prime, Ethan, the resub Juno.
In the late 19th century,
Perhaps
the city of London was the largest in the world. A sprawling metropolis and a melting pot for trade, finance, and people. But in the autumn of 1888, an horrific story emerged from the capital's East End. A story so dreadful, it sent shockwaves around the world. One after another, destitute women of the East End fell victim to a vicious killer known as Jack the Ripper. Despite an extensive manhunt and a few close calls, the Ripper was never caught.
Jack the Ripper was in Shanghai Nights.
Came to an abrupt end.
That's how I learned about him.
Behind one of the greatest mysteries in the annals of crime.
Thanks to Tier 1 Delta, the resub Larzified and Toasty, and the bits 6 Pandas. I hope you feel better, Pillow Pete.
In the East End of London, there's a district known as Whitechapel. In the late 19th century, Whitechapel was known for its overcrowded slums, where many of the capital's poor and unemployed had taken refuge. Day and night, an army of policemen would constantly patrol this labyrinthine network of dim-lit streets, courts, and alleys. One such place was a narrow passage known as George Yard. Near the north entrance of this passage was a residential complex known as George Yard Buildings.
Not a very inspired name.
It was the morning of August the 7th, 1888, when an upstairs tenant named John Reeves headed out for work. Upon reaching the first floor landing, Reeves encountered the body of a woman lying upon her back in a pool of blood. Horrified by the sight, he stumbled down to the street below in search for help. Constable Thomas Barrett was the first officer on the scene.
Hey, Thomas.
He was soon joined by Dr. Timothy Killeen, who conducted a brief examination. The woman had been stabbed 39 times, primarily in the chest and abdomen. Dr. Killeen estimated that she had been dead for, quote, about 3 hours, thus placing the time of death at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The woman had likely been attacked where she was found, as no blood was found beyond the staircase landing.
But this was
strange, as none of the tenants in this crowded building had heard a single cry for help or a disturbance of any kind. One exception was Amy Hewitt, a tenant who claimed to have heard a lone cry of murder. But this was early in the evening of August the 6th, and the scream had emanated from outside the complex. Hewitt further explained, "The district round here is rather rough, and cries of murder are a frequent, if not nightly occurrence."
It sounds like a real shithole.
Identified as 39-year-old Martha Tabram. Tabram was a mother of 2 and had separated from her husband many years prior.
Amy
her
Schumer.
address was 19 George Street, a common lodging house less than 300 meters from the site of her death. Tabram had made a living through prostitution, and one of her associates was a woman named Mary Ann Connolly. Connolly testified that on the evening of August the 6th, she and Tabram had been out drinking with 2 soldiers. Then, shortly before midnight, the party of 4 had separated. Connolly took her client into Angel Alley, while Tabram guided hers into neighboring George Yard. It was the last time she saw Tabram alive. Barely 2 hours later, Constable Barrett had spoken to a soldier loitering near the north entrance of George Yard.
Well, this is probably the guy.
He told Barrett that he was, quote, waiting for his mate who had gone away with a girl. Half an hour later, Tabram is presumed to have died. Both Connolly and Barrett were called upon to identify the soldiers, but all those accused could provide an alibi. One had been at home with his wife, another at an army base, and yet another in a completely different part of the city. This was enough for Inspector Edmund Reed, the lead investigator on the case, to abandon this line of inquiry. Connolly and Barrett, having both picked out the wrong men, they could not be trusted again, as their evidence would be worthless.
Rough.
Even if a soldier had been responsible, no one could deduce a motive. The people of Whitechapel might have been accustomed to crime and violence, but the sheer brutality of this
I
attack
remember when this was on the
as
news.
frightening as it was confounding.
What the fuck are you, a time traveler?
The
What?
crime
This was
is
in the
one of the most
1800s.
brutal that have occurred for some years. For a poor, defenseless woman to be outraged and stabbed in such a manner is almost beyond belief. These were the concluding remarks delivered at the final inquest held on August the 23rd. Only a week later, things would go from bad to worse.
I remember Jack the Ripper was in the Fate anime. Wasn't who you expected it to be, I'll tell you that much. Leave it to anime to crack the case.
On the morning of August the 31st, a man named Robert Paul left his home on Foster Street and headed for work. After making a right turn into Bucks Row, he spotted a man standing in the road. The man turned around to face him and said, "Come and look over here. There's a woman lying at the pavement." The stranger was named Charles Cross, and he too had been on his way to work when he first caught sight of the woman. The two men now cautiously approached. The woman's hands were cold to the touch, and Cross believed she was dead. Paul, however, thought he could sense faint breathing. But instead of seeking immediate help, Cross and Paul were more concerned about being late for work. As such, they quickly resumed their morning commute, hoping to notify policemen along the way.
Jesus Christ.
Fortunately, Constable John Neal was just around the corner. Neal was equipped with a lantern and found the woman lying on her back with a deep cut across
Chris,
the
there
throat.
is no new slapping, man.
The wound was still bleeding and parts of her body were still warm. He was soon joined by Constable John Thane, who was sent at once to fetch a nearby doctor. Upon his arrival, shortly after 4 o'clock, Dr. Reese Llewellyn estimated that, quote, "she had not been dead more than half an hour." In other words, Cross and Paul had likely found the woman mere minutes after she was killed. Furthermore, 3 officers had patrolled the vicinity just a few minutes prior. Constable Neal had last inspected Bucks Row at approximately 3:15. So too had Sergeant Henry Kirby, whereas Constable Thane had merely passed the end of the street, none of whom had seen nor heard anything amiss. Upon the body's removal to the mortuary, a shocking
Tier 1
discovery was
covered
made.
caramel and Recipe
Apart
Cooper.
from 2 incisions in the throat, the woman had also been, quote, disemboweled. As the sun was rising on
Hey,
September,
John.
a man named John Richardson was on his way to work. At 4:45, he made a quick stop at 29 Hanbury Street. He went through the entrance and out the back door by way of a cramped hallway. Richardson then sat down on the backyard steps before grabbing a knife to trim a vexing piece of leather from his boot. Once satisfied, he left the building and shut the front door behind him.
You can give some psycho
About an hour
research
later,
spec.
a third-floor tenant of the same address, John Davis, plodded downstairs.
How many fucking Johns live here? Holy
The
shit.
front door was now wide open,
This is already the
but the
fourth
one
John.
in the back was closed. When Davis went to open it, he found the bloodied remains of a woman lying on her back just below the steps. Inspector Joseph Chandler was the first officer on the
Jesus fucking
After
Christ.
inspection, he sent it once for a medic. Dr. George Phillips arrived at 6:30 and found the woman, quote, terribly mutilated. The throat had been, quote, dissevered deeply, whereas the abdomen had been, quote, entirely laid open. The intestines had been, quote, lifted out of the body and placed by the shoulder of the corpse.
God damn.
The body was then conveyed to the mortuary, while Inspector Chandler and Dr. Phillips conducted a sweep of the backyard.
But what does
What
ace
about
pilot
the
John
tenants of the
Richards think of
building?
this?
But just below the resting place of the
Or
woman's
Prime
feet,
Minister
they found a
John
small piece
Washington?
of cloth and 2 combs. The items had likely belonged to the victim, but it seemed to Dr. Phillips that they had been deliberately positioned and arranged by the killer. The post-mortem revealed that 2 brass rings had been forcefully removed from the victim's left hand. These rings were nowhere to be found. Portions of the victim's abdomen had also gone missing, including the womb. Dr. Phillips believed that, quote,
Trophy.
the mode in which these portions were extracted showed some anatomical knowledge. This point was greatly expanded upon at a subsequent inquest. The injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. For instance, no mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room.
Thanks, Resub
The
Luthmore.
victim was quickly identified as Annie Chapman. Chapman's date of birth is a bit uncertain, but she was roughly 47 at the time of her death. She had at least 7 children, but was tragically only survived by 2. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 35 Dorset Street. On the night of her death, Chapman had been denied accommodations as she lacked the funds to pay for a bed. She was escorted off the premises by the night watchman, who then saw her vanish into a nearby alleyway. What happened to Chapman over the next few hours, nobody knows. Her whereabouts during this time is a complete mystery. But unlike the 2 previous cases, a witness in the Chapman case might have caught a glimpse of the killer.
Oh.
At 5:30 on the morning of
Can they
September
draw them?
8th, a woman named Elizabeth Long spotted a man and a woman conversing outside 29 Hanbury Street. Long was positive that the woman she'd seen was Annie Chapman, but the man had stood with his back towards Long, so she never saw his face.
Useless.
Long did, however, manage to overhear a fragment of their conversation. The man had posed the question, "Will you?" To which the woman responded, "Yes."
Ah, wow, nice. He's in.
Now, a lasting point of contention in the Chapman case is the time of death. According to Dr. Phillips, when he arrived at 6:30, Chapman had been dead for, quote, at least 2 hours. That would place her death at around 4:30. But according to Long, she saw Chapman alive a full hour later. Then there's the testimony of John Richardson. Richardson was the son of one of the tenants in the building. At 4:45, he made a routine checkup on the door to the basement, which had previously suffered a break-in. When he found it secure, he sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot. Even though he sat mere centimeters from the murder site, Richardson did not see a body. He was adamant on this point.
Well, yeah, it would have been hard to
Failed
miss.
to notice the deceased if she had been there.
It would have been really, really hard to
muddle
miss
the
that
timeline
somehow.
even further, there's the testimony of Albert Kadosh. About 20 minutes past 5, Kadosh had gone through the backyard of 27 Hanbury Street when he heard voices coming from nearby. They were barely audible, however, and Kaddish had only made out the word no. A few minutes later, he heard something falling against the wooden fence, dividing the 2 yards.
Why wouldn't he check that out?
There's no one way to untangle this web of contradictions, but Dr. Phillips did concede the possibility that he'd miscalculated. That, quote, the coldness of the morning and the great loss of blood had skewed his opinion, which was largely based on the warmth of the body. So, presuming that Dr. Phillips did miscalculate, and the recollections of Long and Kaddish were off by a few minutes, that would place Chapman's death at around 5:30.
Is that super helpful information in this case, though? I feel like that isn't really going to help very
much. The dim
much.
light of dawn would have provided the tenants of 29 Hanbury Street an unobstructed view of the murder site, some of whom had even slept with their windows open. In spite of this, the killer managed to evade detection and even made time to arrange the victim's possessions.
Yeah, it's extremely lucky, I guess.
As the tally of victims gradually mounted,
Thanks to the Prime
public
Human Bear
grew
in Tier
increasingly
1.
anxious.
Not the
They were
days.
not only frightened by the murders, but frustrated with the police and their perceived incompetence. Even across the pond were the efforts of the police fiercely criticized. The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world.
What the fuck do you mean? Like, I can't even be mad at the detective force here. This guy fucking murdered a woman in the backyard of like an apartment complex where people were sleeping with their windows open and none of these idiots saw anything? More like London has the dumbest tenants in the world. Like, how do you miss that? And a guy even allegedly heard the body hit the fence and then didn't bother to check. It's absolutely not the police's problem that everyone there is fucking stupid. I don't blame them at all. They've done nothing wrong so far.
What these mocking quotes and illustrations failed to capture were the overwhelming odds stacked in favor of the perpetrator. The police were up against someone who seemingly struck without motive, someone who left no murder weapon and few witnesses. On top of that, the East End was severely overcrowded, while the police were understaffed.
I feel bad for the
As
police.
one newspaper put it, a man in the East End of London is a grain of sand, as invisible and almost as much beyond identification amid the masses. At no point would this become more apparent than during the events of September the 30th.
Man, this guy is...
Throat had been, quote, fearfully cut.
Even in pitch
That,
black, I
quote,
feel like
a
you'd see
stream
that.
of blood
Like,
was trickling down.
much more obviously.
Eagle, Deemschutz, and a few others promptly dispersed to find a policeman. While a growing crowd of bystanders waited
No
for
moonlight. I guess without moonlight,
there
it's
was no
possible.
sign of the perpetrator.
I didn't think of no moonlight. Because it could have been like a really cloudy night
But
or some
across
shit.
the city, less than a kilometer to the west, an even more ghoulish discovery was about to be made. At 1:30 of the same morning, Constable Edward Watkins patrolled an open space known as Mitre Square. Watkins' beat would take him through the square about once every 13 minutes, and on this occasion, it was deserted. But in the time it took Watkins to complete another rotation, Mitre Square was turned into a crime scene. I next came in at 1:44. I turned to the right. I saw the body of a woman lying there on her back. I saw her throat was cut and her bowels protruding. The stomach was ripped up. She was lying in a pool of blood.
Damn.
Dr. George Cicada and Dr. Frederick Brown soon converged upon the scene. They found terrible injuries inflicted upon the woman's face, throat, and abdomen. The intestines had been, quote, drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. Among the many lacerations to the face, Dr. Brown noted that, quote, the lobe and auricle of the right ear was cut obliquely through. Based on their expert opinions, coupled with the testimony of Watkins, the woman had died within minutes of her body being found. Back in Berners,
Maybe Jack the Ripper was a bunch of people. I'm sure that's a theory.
Conclusion. The woman in
Like it was a
Buckles
cult.
Yard had died within minutes of her body being found. But unlike previous victims, she had only suffered injuries to the throat. There were no abdominal mutilations or anything else by which to connect the attack to the others. But the murder in Dyatlov yard and the one in Mitre Square were separated by less than 1 kilometer and some 45 minutes. This allowed for a chilling possibility. It was suspected then, as it continues to be today, that when Diemschutz came clattering through the gateway, he unwittingly interrupted the murder. The killer may even have become trapped inside Dyatlov yard because the gate on Berners Street was the only point of entry. Perhaps they saw an opportunity to escape when Diemschutz then rushed inside the club.
Damn you!
From there,
Fucking
it had
Lewis.
taken them less than 15 minutes to reach Mitre Square. Plenty of time to hunt for another victim. But it must be emphasized that this is pure speculation. There is no evidence to suggest the two murders were even connected.
Make the resub anonymous.
The woman in Dyatlov yard was identified as 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride. Stride was a Swedish immigrant who'd lived in London for over 2 decades. Following the death of her husband, she had made a living through prostitution. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street.
Make the resub gentle
On the
lolly.
night of her death,
An
Stride had
infinite
been
rule.
seen by quite an abundance
And
of witnesses.
Sama?
First, she was seen in the company of a, quote, respectably dressed
And
man
Berg.
around 11 o'clock. About 1:45, Stride was seen talking to a man who was, quote, decently dressed and had the appearance of a clerk. Then, only a few minutes before the murder, Stride was seen in the company of a man by Constable William Smith. The man was carrying a small parcel wrapped in newspaper and was of, quote, respectable appearance.
It's
unclear whether
Julian,
these
and
descriptions
resub
are of the same person or if Stride accosted multiple clients as the night progressed. There were other witnesses, some less credible than others, but the one that really stood out from the rest was Israel Schwartz. About 1:45, Schwartz had been walking down Berners Street. As he came up on Dyatlov yard, he witnessed a man throwing a woman to the ground in front of the entrance. The woman had, quote,
he didn't try and
screamed
help?
3 times, but not very loudly. Schwartz would later identify this woman as Elizabeth Stride. Schwartz did not try to intervene, but opted instead to simply cross the street. That's when he spied a second man on the opposite side who was lighting a pipe.
Alright,
The man who attacked the
Israel.
woman then appeared to address the second man by shouting the name Lipsky. The pipe smoker then proceeded to follow Schwartz before eventually breaking away. When taken at face value, this story appears to suggest that the killer had an accomplice by the name of Lipsky. This was indeed the interpretation of some government officials. But Inspector Frederick Abeline, one of the lead investigators on the case, had a very different interpretation. You see, the name Lipsky had gained notoriety in 1887 when a Jewish man by the name of Israel Lipsky was convicted of murder. Owing to the publicity of that case, the surname Lipsky had become an anti-Semitic slur. Abeline therefore deduced that the man who shouted Lipsky was directing an insult at Schwartz, who was described as having a, quote, strong Jewish appearance. The man with the pipe, meanwhile, may have been an innocent passerby who became frightened along with Schwartz. Whether Abeline's interpretation is correct,
So
it's
they didn't
doubtful
try and help at all? This man
Nevertheless, Schwartz's account is compelling.
straight up
as he
throws the woman
conceivably
down,
witnessed
getting ready to
the
murder her,
moment
and they just
when
walk by?
Elizabeth Stride was attacked.
Fucking rough. Thanks, Risa,
Back in
Morthar,
Richter
Swifty,
Square,
and Trust
a
Cuz.
large crowd of spectators had assembled upon the
They could have at
scene,
least started yelling, like,
all driven
ah,
by their morbid
ooh,
curiosity
ah,
to get
don't
evidence
kill
of the
her.
body. The post-mortem revealed that the killer had extracted a few organs, including the womb and left kidney. According to Dr. Brown, this extraction required, quote, a good deal of knowledge, which he likened to that of a butcher. By contrast, Dr. Cicada did not find any signs of, quote, great anatomical skill. The woman in Mitre ultimately escaped.
he was a
They did
policeman.
not do so without leaving a trace.
I would
Shortly
believe
before
that.
3 o'clock,
But I do think
a
it's multiple
blood-stained piece
people.
of cloth was found near the entrance to a building a few blocks to the northeast. It proved to be a ripped portion of the apron worn by Eddowes. The patch had evidently been torn off and then discarded by the killer upon their escape.
It sounds cute, Hunter. Thanks the Prime G Wiz.
Now, on the wall above this patch of apron, someone had written a message. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. To this day, both the meaning and the author of this message remain in doubt. Was it written by the killer? Was it an attempt to cast suspicion upon or even away from the Jewish community? Was it completely unrelated to the murder?
Yeah, I don't know what the fuck that means.
Similar questions would soon be raised by a few letters. Letters which had supposedly been written and posted by the killer. Three days before the murder On the morning of November the 9th, a merchant and property owner named John McCarthy was going through his bookkeeping.
Hey, John.
McCarthy was the landlord of Miller's Court, and the tenants of room 13 had fallen behind on their rent. McCarthy sent at once for his assistant, Thomas Boyer, to collect the money at 11:15. After knocking twice without response, Boyer went around the corner to peer through a window.
Thanks to resub.
But his view was
Fate.
obstructed by a coat or curtain, so Boyer had to reach through a broken window pane to pull it aside. That's when he saw the severely mutilated body of a woman lying upon a bed in the corner of the room. Miller's Court was soon crawling with police, but the door to room 13 was locked and had to be forced open with a pickaxe. What they found inside was truly the stuff of nightmares. The sight we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again. Dr. George Phillips described the body as, quote, cut all to pieces. Dr. Thomas Bond described the woman's face as, quote, hacked beyond recognition. The abdomen had been, quote, emptied of its viscera, while the throat had been, quote, severed all round, down to the bone. The body had been monstrously disfigured, with loose organs dispersed all around it. The room itself was sparsely furnished and offered little in the way of clues. 2 tables, 1 or 2 chairs, and a small cabinet.
But what about the security cameras?
Amongst the ashes of a fireplace, the police found patches of burned clothing. Had the killer tried to dispose of evidence, or had it merely been used for warmth and light? The victim was identified almost immediately. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was the tenant of 13 Miller's Court. But nearly everything about Kelly's life is shrouded in mystery. She was presumably of Welsh or Irish descent and in her mid-20s, making her the youngest victim by far.
Thanks to the
But
gifts of
given
Heaven
that no
Sword.
matching records of a Mary Jane Kelly
Yeah,
have
it's
been
everywhere in
found,
F. I
it's
saw.
probable that she was using a fake identity. In any case, Kelly had not been living alone. Up until a few days before the murder, she had cohabited with a man named Joseph Barnett. They had only separated on October the 30th because Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution
Thanks to
and the
Andrewski
people with whom
and
she
Han Solo.
associated. But they did see each other again. On the evening of November the 8th, Barnett paid Kelly a visit. Upon his arrival, he found Kelly in the company of a woman who was just about to leave. Unfortunately, there are conflicting accounts about who this woman was, when Barnett arrived, and how long he stayed. If we choose to believe Barnett, he arrived at some point between 7 and 7:45 and left before 9 o'clock. Shortly before midnight, Kelly was spotted in the company of a man by her neighbor, Mary Ann Cox. When Cox passed the couple, they were about to enter Kelly's room. Cox bid Kelly goodnight, but she was, quote, very much intoxicated and barely able to respond. Once they had gone inside, Cox could hear Kelly singing. When Cox then left the court about an hour later, Kelly could still be heard singing. By 2 o'clock, Kelly had apparently ventured back outside, for she was spotted by a man named George Hutchinson. The two of them were supposedly well acquainted, and Kelly had asked if he could spare a few coins. But Hutchinson was broke, and Kelly was desperate for money, so they soon parted ways. Moments later, Hutchinson observed Kelly being accosted by a well-dressed man. The two of them had a seemingly jovial interaction and began walking north.
Chasing George.
Hutchinson found it suspicious that such a well-dressed man would seek the company of a woman like Kelly. As such, when the couple passed him by, he scrutinized the man's appearance. He was, for instance, carrying a pair of gloves in his right hand and a small parcel in his left. Hutchinson decided to shadow the couple as they proceeded to Miller's Court.
Wow,
Before they vanished up the
Hutchinson.
court, the man handed Kelly a red handkerchief, and she had supposedly told him, "All right, my dear, come along. You will be comfortable." Hutchinson remained in the vicinity until 3 o'clock, but neither Kelly nor the man reappeared.
So he just
At
sat there for an
roughly the
hour?
same time, Cox returned home. In stark contrast to the loud singing upon her last departure, Cox was now struck by the complete absence of sound and light from Kelly's room. Finally, at approximately 4 o'clock, a tenant above and a woman across from Kelly's room heard cries of murder. The voice was that of a woman, and it appeared to emanate from nearby.
And they didn't do anything?
Meanwhile, other denizens of the court heard no screams at all. According to Dr. Bond, Kelly died between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Phillips placed the time of death a few hours later. But some witnesses were quite adamant that they had seen or even spoken to Kelly as late as 8 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Keep in mind that her body was discovered at 11:15. These contradictions are difficult to reconcile, and the precise time of death eludes us to this day.
Well, how about the people that heard the cries of murder? Why? Can we ask them why they didn't do anything? And what about Hutchinson, who just sat there
Mary Jane
scoping it out?
is typically regarded as the Ripper's final victim. Along with Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, she is part of the canonical 5, the 5 victims most likely to have been slain by the same hand. Martha Tabram might have been a victim of Jack the Ripper, but opinions are divided. The same is true of at least a handful of other cases. Even the canonical 5 are not without controversy, so the total number of victims is a matter of debate. Presuming that Kelly was indeed the final victim, one has to wonder why. Why did the murders come to such a sudden end? Did the Ripper give in to fears of being caught? Were they imprisoned for a different crime? Perhaps they succumbed to an illness or committed suicide. Could they have migrated to another country? Perhaps they deliberately changed their modus operandi to confuse the police. The possibilities are virtually endless, which means there is no shortage of suspects.
Thanks to the bits Helio and give some plasmality. Thank you, Enigmata.
Following the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, a rumor began to circulate that someone called Leather Apron was in the habit of abusing prostitutes. The name quickly made its way into the press, and soon enough it became synonymous with the killer. In fact, Leather Apron was the predominant pseudonym before Jack the Ripper. But the man identified as Leather Apron was soon cleared of all suspicion. His real name was John Picer, and he was in a different part of London on the night when Nichols was attacked. This misguided manhunt is somewhat emblematic of the whole investigation. The police pursued even the most tenuous of leads due to a lack of evidence, and
they should have just hung out at prostitutes' places.
They interviewed thousands, investigated hundreds,
just post up like an officer at the main prostitute hotspots.
In the words of Inspector Frederick Abeline, "Theories. We were lost almost in theories. There were so many of them." In an effort to narrow down the search, the police used a primitive form of criminal profiling. The idea was to analyze the available evidence to try and gauge what sort of person had committed the crimes. This profile was prepared by Dr. Thomas Bond, and he described the Ripper as a strong, middle-aged man with an inoffensive appearance who dressed respectably. Bond's most controversial...
Jesus, who is that one? Peter Pan?
...possessed, quote, "no scientific nor anatomical knowledge." This stood in direct opposition to the opinions of his peers, most of whom ascribed the Ripper with at least a basic understanding of anatomy. Based on the witness accounts, the Ripper was a man of average height with a medium to stout build in his late 20s to mid-30s. He wore dark clothes, including a hat of some sort, and had a mustache. But this sort of aggregation or tabulation of accounts can be quite deceptive. Not only are many details inconsistent, but they could be describing entirely different people. For all we know, none of the witnesses ever laid eyes on Jack the Ripper. So much is up for debate that one can build a case against almost any suspect. Some have even entertained the possibility that the Ripper was a woman or possibly a man disguised as a woman. While Jill or Jackie the Ripper is an interesting theory, it has failed to achieve any widespread support. What is rarely in dispute is that the Ripper was either a resident of or otherwise familiar with the East End. After all, he managed to narrowly evade capture on multiple occasions, which implies intimate knowledge of byways and patrol routes. He likely had some form of employment, as the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays, and he may have had some degree of anatomical knowledge.
I don't think he
With
did.
this unshakable profile in hand,
I think he's a
let's
fucking
take
idiot.
a closer look at a few suspects. The question is, where do we even begin? According to criminal profiler and FBI Special Agent John Douglas, the Ripper was not only a local, but was likely interviewed by the police. If Douglas is correct, the Ripper might be someone we've already met, either a witness or a person close to one of the victims. What about John Richardson, the witness in the Chapman case who sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot? Richardson was indeed suspected by the police, but they found, quote, not a shred of evidence against
Prime
him.
Hunter.
His mother also lived on the premises, so he had good reason to be there.
Thanks, you give sub Steve.
What about George Hutchinson, the witness who followed Mary Jane Kelly after she was accosted by a well-dressed client? Hutchinson never clarified his motivation for shadowing the couple. He merely stated that he was surprised to see a man so well-dressed in the company of a woman like Kelly. Was he surprised because he was concerned? Was he jealous? Was it about money? After all, Hutchinson was broke, and the client appeared to be wealthy. Perhaps he waited outside the court with the intention of mugging this well-dressed client. There are many question marks surrounding Hutchinson. He has never been positively identified, so next to nothing is known about his life. This makes it very difficult to build a strong case against him. Hutchinson was interrogated by the police, but ultimately convinced Inspector Frederick Abeline that he was telling the truth. But not every witness attracted such attention from the police. Take, for instance, Charles Cross, the man who discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols.
Of course there's still much slapping.
On the morning of
no new
August
ones
the
yet.
31st, Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street and headed for work. When he turned into Bucks Row, he happened upon the body of Mary Ann Nichols. Moments later, he was joined by Robert Paul, and events transpired as previously described. Despite his proximity to the crime, Cross appears to have escaped suspicion from both the press and the police. He was evidently seen as the innocent passerby that he appeared to be. But in recent years, that perception has been challenged. The argument is that Cross was in the act of committing the murder when he was interrupted by the approaching footsteps of Paul. Cross then concealed the murder weapon and portrayed himself as someone who just found the body. The injuries inflicted upon Nichols would be consistent with an interruption, as they were less severe than those of later victims. What's interesting about Cross is that he likely testified under a false name. He claimed to be employed as a carman, and his address was given as 22 Doveton Street. But surviving records show that in 1888, this address was occupied by a man named Charles Lechmere.
Maybe he forgot his last name.
As a carman, and on at least one occasion went by the name Charles Cross, as it was the surname of his stepfather. It is now widely believed that Charles Lechmere was the man who appeared at the inquest, and that he assumed the name of his stepfather when he testified. His motivation for doing so has been the source of much speculation. Was he trying to conceal his identity?
I'm convinced.
Or was it merely a force of habit? After all, contemporary examples of people doing the exact same thing are not difficult to find.
Steve.
The most compelling evidence against Lechmere is that his morning commute between home and work roughly coincides with the time and place of the murders.
It's definitely this fucking guy.
Except for the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, who
but they're not
killed
far.
on Sunday, the only day when Lechmere would have been free from work. Not only that, but all the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays. Why would a man who supposedly timed the murders with his morning commute gravitate towards days of rest? In any case, Lechmere's mother lived a few blocks south of Burness Street,
He said
the neighborhoods
brick
around which
the prime
is
Mac.
also where Lechmere spent his childhood. As such, it's speculated that Stride and Eddowes were killed after Lechmere paid a late-night visit to his mother. While he claimed to be employed at a delivery firm known as Pickford's, there are no surviving records of his employment. If he did work for Pickford's, there is a fair chance that he delivered meat and would thus have been exposed to slaughter and blood on a daily basis. Lechmere remained in East London until his death in 1920 at the age of 71. While there is no evidence of Lechmere ever being suspected by the police, it is difficult to believe that he was completely overlooked. Many case files have not survived, so any doubts investigators might have had could have long since disappeared. Now, a witness who definitely attracted attention was Joseph Barnett.
Yeah, but it was Charles Cross. I believe it was Charles Cross. In fact, I know it was. After hearing that, nothing else could convince me otherwise. Until LEMMiNO makes a great case for Joseph Barnett
was the man who lived with Mary Jane Kelly up until a few days before the murder. He and Kelly had supposedly met around April of 1887, and they eventually moved to 13 Miller's Court. Barnett was employed as a fish porter, but for reasons unknown, he lost his job between July and August of 1888. From that point onwards, the couple struggled to pay rent, and Kelly resorted back to prostitution. Now, those who believe that Barnett was the Ripper view his loss of employment as a turning point. The argument is that Barnett was so overcome with guilt and anguish for driving Kelly back to prostitution that he went on a murder spree, murdering one local prostitute after another in a desperate attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets. While most of this is pure speculation, it is true that Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution. You may recall that Barnett separated from Kelly on October the 30th because he disliked the prostitutes with whom she associated. Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house. This might further explain why Kelly was the Ripper's final and most viciously mutilated victim, the implication being that Barnett felt rejected by Kelly and wanted revenge for the breakup. According to Barnett, he did pay Kelly a visit on the evening of November the 8th, but they had parted on quote, friendly terms. He then supposedly went home, played a card game until 12:30 before going to bed.
Did he play Yu-Gi-Oh?
Now, Kelly is presumed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, so Barnett could have returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. While the police did subject him to 4 hours of interrogation, Barnett was ultimately released without charge.
Thanks you get so Disraeli. The bit Steve.
Then there's the matter of the locked door. When the police arrived at Miller's Court, they had to force the door open with a pickaxe. This raised an important question. How did the killer lock the door behind him? According to Barnett, the key to room 13 had been missing for some time. Because of this, he and Kelly would quote, open the door by reaching through the broken window. The door was said to be equipped with a quote, catch lock, and evidently locked itself upon being closed. If that's true, mystery solved. But even if the door was not self-locking, there's still an obvious solution. All the killer would have had to do is observe Kelly using the window trick and then employ that same technique to fasten the door upon leaving. But those who favor Barnett as the Ripper offer yet another solution. The key never went missing. Instead, Barnett is said to have stolen the key and then used it on the night of the murder. These solutions are all equally valid, and it's impossible to know which one is correct.
Yeah, but it's with Charles Cross.
There is a slight variation of this theory which states that Barnett did murder Kelly, but was not the Ripper. Instead, he merely emulated the Ripper to deflect attention away from himself. Once again, this is pure speculation, but the murder of Kelly did somewhat differ from the rest in that it was committed indoors. Barnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. While it's only natural for suspicion to fall upon witnesses and acquaintances, Victorian detectives did pursue other lines of inquiry. One prominent theory was that the Ripper suffered from insanity, and a prime suspect in that category is Aaron Kosminski.
Who? We haven't heard that name yet. Have we? I don't remember
The Whitechapel
Kosminski.
murders investigation was overseen by numerous high-ranking officers within the Metropolitan Police. One of them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Upon his retirement, Anderson repeatedly and unequivocally stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name of the suspect, Anderson described him as a, quote, low-class Polish Jew who was, quote, safely caged in an asylum. He'd been identified by a witness who was described as, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer. This unnamed witness had supposedly refused to testify because the suspect was, quote, a fellow Jew. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course. While Anderson never revealed the name of the suspect, his colleagues were a bit more forthcoming. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson revealed that his surname was Kosminski.
Thank you, Donald.
Yet another high-ranking officer, Melville McNaughton, described Kosminski as a homicidal and misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Surviving records show that an Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1891. Aaron was indeed from Poland, he was Jewish, and had lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and a paranoid fear of being fed by others. He was trained as a barber, but had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years.
Thanks to Resub Hexmania.
It's unclear when his mental health began to decline, but upon being institutionalized, Aaron was deemed to be harmless. He was, quote, quiet and well-behaved, and, quote, apathetic as a rule. Only on rare occasions would he get, quote, excited and violent. However, before his confinement, Aaron had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against him largely hinges upon the claims made by Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, especially the claim that an unnamed witness identified a suspect named Kosminski.
There had to be a witness
But the
at some point
descriptions of
here.
that suspect
These
are
murders
not
were committed in
entirely
front of fucking
consistent
apartments.
with Aaron Kosminski. For instance, McNaughton stated that the suspect had been, quote, removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. Aaron was first confined in 1891. Swanson wrote that the suspect had been, quote, sent to the asylum and died shortly afterwards. Aaron was still alive at the time and spent nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. As such, it is possible that the suspect Kosminski was someone other than Aaron Kosminski. It's also possible that these inconsistencies were mere lapses in memory. After all, these events were recounted years or even decades after the fact, and McNaughton even confessed to writing solely from memory.
Thanks to Resub Chad.
Regardless of
And
the suspect's
Arab-
true identity, Anderson
Bubbles.
was the only one who seemed convinced of his guilt. McNaughton ultimately favored a different suspect and stated that, quote,
There you go, Eric.
many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one. Inspector Edmund Reed was of the same opinion. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. So when Anderson wrote that there was, quote, no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal, he merely expressed his personal opinion. There was in fact ample doubt and no consensus amongst the police. But in recent years, Aaron Kosminski has been resurrected as a prime suspect due to a controversial DNA analysis.
Oh.
Okay, so back in 1888, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson
They found his
is
old
said to
cum
have
sock?
stolen a blood-stained shawl from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes. This shawl was then passed down from one generation to the next
Why?
before being submitted for DNA testing in 2011. DNA samples were extracted from the shawl and then compared against maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski.
What?
In both cases, it was a match. If the subsequent news coverage is to be believed, the mystery has now been, quote, definitively solved. Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. But as you can imagine, it's never quite that simple.
That's fucking
First of all, the
wild.
provenance or chain of custody of the shawl is severely lacking. There is no evidence of a shawl being found at the crime scene, nor is there any evidence of Simpson ever being at the crime scene. Furthermore, a destitute woman like Eddowes is unlikely to have owned such an expensive item. Second of all, the type of DNA used to identify Eddowes and Kosminski was mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse of the cell. And this type of DNA is passed down through the female line and is not unique to any one individual. Thousands can share the same mitochondrial DNA, which means it can't be used to pinpoint a specific person. In the words of a geneticist, based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. So to say that the mystery has been definitively solved is widely inaccurate. There's still plenty of room for doubt. So, to recap, a suspect named Kosminski was identified by an unknown witness. This was enough to convince at least one senior officer of his guilt. That suspect may have been Aaron Kosminski, a man who was largely non-violent but once threatened his sister with a knife. Aaron can neither be incriminated nor eliminated by the DNA evidence. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care and died in 1919 at the age of 53. Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by a high-ranking officer. A completely different suspect who still falls into the same category is Francis Tumblety.
Damn, that guy looks cool. I still think it's Charles Cross.
2 days
I really
before the
do.
murder of Mary Jane Kelly,
All that made so much
an
sense
American
for Cross.
physician named Francis Tumblety was arrested in London. As you can probably tell from this photograph, Tumblety was quite an eccentric character. He was born in Ireland around 1833, but was raised in the United States. From an early age, Tumblety gained a reputation for being a medicaster or quack doctor. He engaged in all sorts of medically dubious practices and advertised himself as the Indian herb doctor. He promised to cure anything from dyspepsia and scurvy to cancer and blindness using nothing but medicinal herbs.
Man, some things never change.
Tumblety
There's
was
still
busy
people
running from
just
the law.
like this.
He was either accused or convicted for crimes like theft and assault, attempt to induce a miscarriage, and manslaughter of a patient. He was even implicated in the assassination of US President Abraham Lincoln, but was ultimately cleared of suspicion. Now, in the early 1860s, Tumblety is alleged to have hosted a lavish dinner party.
What are you talking
in
about?
Washington.
Did you even
men were
message the
invited to
miniature
this
journey?
dinner, and Tumblety
Just
had
message the
supposedly
support man. Why are you
expressed
messaging
fierce
Twitch
hatred
mods?
of women. Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet
They
in his
weren't involved in
office
it. Just message
in
the
which he stored
support
a
man.
vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens, some of which were said to contain the wombs of, quote, every class of woman. In 1869, Tumblety ventured across the Atlantic and visited England for the first time. By his own admission, he roamed the streets of London until he became familiar with every part
It's
of it.
been weeks, no
He
reply.
advertised
I know that's
himself as
wrong because the
great
posters would have
American
only got there
doctor
about a week
and had a
ago.
few skirmishes with the police.
Just resend the email then, man.
After a few more voyages between the old world and the new, Tumblety found himself in London in the autumn of 1888. The purpose of his visit and whereabouts at the time of the murders are completely unknown. Tumblety never stayed in one place for long and made frequent use of false names. There is a story of a mysterious lodger leaving behind a blood-stained shirt near the murder site of Elizabeth Stride. This supposedly happened on the night of the murder, and some believe that this lodger was Francis Tumblety.
Nah, I think it's definitely Charles Cross.
There is no firm evidence of that, and the entire incident is fraught with uncertainty.
Oh, sweet. Well, thanks, Chainsaw. Glad you liked it.
What we do know is that Tumblety was arrested in London on November the 7th. According to the press, as well as Tumblety himself, he was arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered, and it's unclear whether Tumblety was still in custody or had already been released on bail. Nevertheless, he was ultimately charged with 4 counts of gross indecency, which had nothing to do with the murders. But Tumblety had no intention of standing trial. Instead, he made his way across the English Channel, boarded a steamship under a false name, and fled back to America. He was pursued by detectives and kept under surveillance, but his offenses were, quote, not extraditable. As such, Tumblety remained in the United States and never returned to England.
That is suspicious.
Francis Tumblety was a misogynistic medicaster who was in London at the time of the murders. He even showcased a collection of wombs, and the Ripper did indeed extract the womb from 2 of his victims. I mean, he sounds like the perfect suspect. Perhaps a bit too perfect. There is no doubt that Tomlety was in London in 1888, but the claim that he was a misogynistic collector of human body parts is extremely dubious. It can be traced back to a single article from December of 1888 featuring an interview with a man named Charles Dunham. Dunham had a long history of spreading misinformation and has been described as a pathological liar, a forger, and a conman. He was even convicted of perjury. As such, there is every reason to believe that this story is a complete fabrication.
Yeah, I still was never convinced. I always thought it was Charles Cross.
Furthermore,
for the
Tomlety was
last 10
both
minutes.
older and taller than the men described by most witnesses. Tomlety was said to be, quote, an enormous man who liked to dress in flamboyant and militaristic outfits. It's difficult to imagine a tall, pompous American sneaking around the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected. On the other hand, it's unclear which, if any, of the witness accounts can be trusted. Then there's the
Tier
matter
1
of the
Seth
rings.
Scott in the
You
Prime
may
Club
recall
resub
that
kick
2
ass.
brass rings were stolen from the body of Annie Chapman. It's suspected that the rings were taken by the Ripper to be kept as trophies. Now, upon his death in 1903, Tomlety left behind a quite impressive estate. But among his many valuable possessions were a pair of inexpensive imitation rings.
Oh,
Could
shit.
they have been the same rings taken from the body of Chapman?
That's pretty interesting.
It's possible. It's also impossible to prove.
God damn it. I still think it's Charles
Chief
Cross.
Inspector John Littlechild regarded Tomlety as a, quote,
Thanks to be
very likely
thirsty.
suspect. And it's not difficult to see why. If the many rumors about him are to be believed,
Yeah, no, first I heard
Tomlety
of
had
that
both
oily
opportunity and motive to commit the murders.
Yeah, send an
But
email
there
to it,
lies the
Scander, and they'll
problem.
get it to you.
Much of what
But
we know
yeah,
about
it'll be there
Tomlety
pretty soon, I
is founded
imagine.
upon unsubstantiated rumors. Tomlety himself was an attention-seeking charlatan with no qualms about lies and deception. With a suspect like that, one can never be certain where the lies end and the truth begins.
I still think Charles Cross. Instead of his real name, which was Charles Lechmere. That was very... Thanks, Deasley. Yeah, we can do Consumed by the Apocalypse. I haven't seen this one yet, I don't think.
Of all the species to have ever lived, all but a tiny fraction have gone extinct. At some point in the future, the same
shit's
fate
wild, Wassy.
will befall humanity. It may take centuries, it might take eons, but extinction is unavoidable.
Not true.
The future is
With
fraught
CRISPR.
uncertainty, and the apocalypse.
Oh, is this going to be like Nibiru?
Nearly
Nibiru?
800,000 years ago, an approximately 1 kilometer wide asteroid collided with Earth. The crater has yet to be located, but fragments from the impact
Yeah, I've seen that
have been
feedback.
found scattered across the eastern hemisphere, an expansive strewn field
I'm
that
familiar
covers
with that
up
as well,
to
Sweaty.
30% of the planet's surface. Our distant ancestors were not only alive to witness this event, but managed to adapt and survive. Impacts of this magnitude occur roughly once every 500,000 to 2 million years. More devastating impacts, like the one that nearly wiped out the dinosaurs, are far less frequent,
Wow.
possibly striking once every 100 million years.
So has that been completely confirmed that it was an
Whether a
asteroid that
collision
killed
of
the
this
dinosaurs?
magnitude is
I don't
survivable
keep up with dinosaur
is a
news.
matter of debate.
Yeah? Okay, cool.
The kinetic energy released upon impact would be equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of billions of atomic bombs.
No, I'm gonna say it's
Those who
confirmed
survived the
because
initial blast
it's said in
would
this
be
video.
subjected to unrelenting earthquakes, firestorms, and tsunamis. A thick layer of smoke and dust would quickly envelop the globe and blot out the sun. An impact winter that could last for months or even years.
Yeah, and the dinosaurs were too
Darkness,
fucking stupid to
freezing
have
cold,
electricity,
and global famine
so they couldn't have
would throw
heaters.
the world into chaos. In spite of this, long-term survival is not inconceivable. Small pockets of humanity may take refuge underground and would at least be given a chance to rebuild civilization. But make no mistake, it would be a close call.
Maybe, but what if we made a giant protective layer around Earth?
The
Made out of
survivability
metal
of an impact
to bounce
also
it
depends
back.
on how much time we have to prepare. More than 90% of nearby asteroids and comets larger than 1 kilometer have already been detected. If one of them were on a collision course with Earth,
I think so, Shock.
we'd know for decades or even centuries in advance.
All good, pal.
But this was not always the case.
Let me see some weed.
In 1983, a 9-kilometer wide comet was only spotted 2 weeks prior to its closest approach.
Oof.
That's 2 weeks of preparation had it been aiming for Earth. While things have significantly improved since 1983, space is impossibly vast. In 2019, an asteroid capable of leveling a city was detected a day before it flew 5 times closer to the Earth than the Moon.
Whoa! I never heard about
While
that.
the odds of an extinction
I wonder
of
what
population
city that would have
are
hit.
remote, it's not impossible. There is a class of objects known as damocloids. Damocloids are typified by their highly eccentric orbits and low reflectivity, meaning they periodically pay us a visit and are extremely difficult to detect. We're currently tracking about 200, but there could
So
be
is this
hundreds
whole
more
video about how
tumbling
Earth
through
could
the solar
end?
system.
The multiple ways, so this one's
Damocloids
focusing
are,
on
on
the
average,
asteroid.
16 kilometers.
Next one will probably be heat death.
If one of them were on a collision course with Earth, there might not be any warning.
I know, guns. I'm just pretty tired of RuneScape, man. I just don't have any goals.
When massive stars die, they explode. If a star went supernova within 30 light years of Earth, it would be cause for concern.
We should really just put jets on this fucking planet so we can move it around.
Fortunately, more than
just in
90% of the stars within this bubble have already been discovered, none of which are at risk of exploding anytime soon. But some supernovae can still pose a threat from thousands of light years away.
It's a gamma-ray burst, produced by only the most violent explosions in the universe. Instead of a spherical blast, a gamma-ray burst will channel the explosion into two highly concentrated beams. More energy is released in a few seconds than the sun will radiate in its entire lifetime.
Whoa, what the fuck? That's pretty cool. It's the second most violent explosion, though, second only to gamer rage. But still pretty impressive
effects of a
stats.
nearby supernova or gamma-ray burst are poorly understood. We do know that the atmosphere would absorb much of the high-energy radiation, but this may also strip the Earth of its protective layer of ozone. If so, harmful levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun would penetrate down to the surface. Certain chemical reactions may also darken the sky and induce global cooling, a cosmic winter of sorts. This could last for years and would be lethal to many plants and animals. In fact, a gamma-ray burst might be responsible for a mass extinction that killed roughly 70% of all marine species nearly 500 million
The
years ago.
late Ordovician
Now, humanity
What
could
the fuck
easily
is that?
protect itself against ultraviolet sun rays, but living through a mass extinction
Thanks, Risa
would
Pepe.
not be a pleasant experience. While some authors
Tetra,
have painted a
elemental.
far bleaker image, with one hemisphere effectively sterilized by intense radiation, these findings have been contested in recent years. The latest research identify ozone depletion as the primary threat. Nevertheless, a gamma-ray burst
These are tier 1
sniping
loud
the
pack.
Earth from across the galaxy is extremely improbable. All of them have so far been extragalactic in origin, much too distant to pose a threat.
Fucking
While
crazy
there are
that
a
you can
few
see shit
potential
across the
candidates within
galaxy.
the Milky Way,
And it looks so lame.
none of them.
That was apparently
will be
more
directed
heat than the
at
sun will ever generate, and it just looked like a small zit. Fucking nuts.
Apart from impact events and stellar explosions, the foreseeable future is free of cosmic threats. Other eventualities are either too improbable or won't happen for millions of years.
Thanks to Prime Pork.
Ample time for us to prepare, other calamities permitting.
I really enjoyed it, Jake. Thanks to the gift sub, only made this sub to Charlie. Imagine if humans didn't need to sleep. We could already have the technology required to just stop gamma bursts and supernovas and
Around
blow up asteroids.
74,000 years ago, a
Fuck
large
sleep.
volcano erupted in Southeast Asia. It is the most powerful volcanic eruption in human history.
Thanks to the gift sub, Crumple. Yeah, no, Exerbia.
For up to 2 weeks, it spewed enormous quantities of ash and dust into the atmosphere, enough to block out the sun and potentially cool the planet. A volcanic winter. But there's great uncertainty about the effects of the eruption on both the climate and humanity. It ranges from
Thanks to
severe,
tier 1. Hey, thanks to tier 1,
mild.
Arcadum.
with the latest research supporting the latter. In either case, this is good news.
I didn't see any
means
of those,
that
Planet Lady.
supervolcanic eruptions
But maybe.
pose little to no threat to human existence.
Damn, thank you, man.
After
Appreciate
all,
the
if early
fucking
humans
generosity.
stood a
Thank you,
chance,
Arcadum.
then so
Thanks for
should
the 10
we.
gift subs, man.
But
Thanks
there
for
is
some
something
crunchy
even
and prime
more
blarney.
destructive than supervolcanic eruptions. It's known
I
as
added
a
you on Discord, by the way, man.
flood basalt event.
I'm excited.
The largest one occurred 250 million years ago. An enormous outpouring of molten rock covered a region of Siberia the size of Europe.
Mount St. Helen is gonna
And
kill us all.
It just so happens to coincide
Well, then do
with the
something about it.
deadliest
Pussy,
mass
stop it.
extinction in history. The good news is, flood basalt events are both rare and slow. Instead of a singular event, it's a series of eruptions taking place over thousands or even millions of years. As such, even if one began tomorrow, it might just be slow enough for us to adapt and survive.
Oh shit.
Throughout the centuries, pandemics have exacted a heavy toll on humankind. Among the worst was the Black Death. In less than a decade, it killed between 25 and 60% of the European population.
Holy shit, I didn't know it was that
Total death
much.
count is unknown. At
God
least
damn.
tens of millions. The
What was-
Colombian exchange of diseases
What was the cause of
and the
that?
Spanish flu claimed the lives of many millions more. The
Holy
tragedy
shit.
of these pandemics and epidemics notwithstanding, they
Rats
never
was
came
the Black
close
Death?
to extinction. None of them killed more than a few percent of the global population. For instance, the Spanish flu infected nearly 1/3 of humanity, yet the vast majority of cases did not result in death. A pathogen that not only infects but also kills every single member of a species is difficult to imagine. In fact, there are very few examples of infectious disease driving a species to extinction. With that being said, it's not inconceivable. For instance, pathogens that can pass between multiple species can be far deadlier than those limited to just one.
Yeah, I
The
definitely didn't see that one,
H5N1
Depresso. That doesn't
avian
sound familiar.
influenza, also known as the bird flu, is one such virus. So far, it's transmissible between humans and birds, but it can't sustainably spread among humans. However, laboratory experiments have shown that it may eventually acquire this ability through natural mutations.
Thanks for Prime Silver.
If so, it could easily become the worst pandemic in human history. But even this horrifying proposition does not come close to extinction. In a worst-case scenario, most of humanity would still survive.
Thanks to Prime Jackson. There's one discovered by Russia,
Pandemics are
H5N8.
complicated. It's a
what the fuck
topic
that
that's
is.
more relevant now than ever before and cannot possibly be done justice in a few short minutes. But in the narrow context of human extinction, it seems unlikely for nature to stumble upon that perfect storm.
Thanks to resub, nice balls, bro.
Apart from volcanic eruptions and natural pandemics, the Earth has no inherent means
Yeah,
of
probably got to.
eradicating the human race.
Still interesting.
No other form of natural calamity is powerful enough to threaten our existence. As such, the most immediate threat to humanity
Is
has for a
humanity
long time
itself.
been, and continues to be, humanity. While nature may
Thanks to
struggle to
Prime
devise a
Elite.
world-ending pandemic, it may not have to. Biotechnology
Thanks to
is
Resub
now
for Speed and
advanced to a
Stewart.
point where we can engineer pathogens in a laboratory. While this can greatly benefit our understanding and treatment of infectious diseases, it's not without risk. Accidental breaches of containment have happened on multiple occasions, and these experiments are not always conducted in the name of science.
Thanks to the gift sub, Eddie. And thanks to the bit
These
Z.
engineered microbes are concerning because their destructive potential far exceeds that of their natural
Christ, how many
counterparts.
are there?
They can be deadlier, more transmissible, and less treatable. And the rapid pace of technological progress is constantly lowering the threshold for bioengineering.
His biggest concern was, he said it in so many words, that a small group of dedicated scientists could create an altered biological agent that could wipe out humanity as we know it.
Technically speaking, you can do almost anything with a microbe. The real question is, will you end up with a microbe that functionally will do the things that the concerned person at your hearing said, namely, essentially wipe out everyone from the face of the earth? Again, that's conceivable, although it's inconceivable, but it is, in fact, anything is possible. It would be very,
nice.
very difficult to do that. Extraordinarily difficult, even in the best of hands, to
Please
not
do
only
some
do
shock.
the engineering to get a microbe that has the characteristics, but be able to spread in a way in which it has virulence, transmissibility, and the ability to go in a sustained, transmissible way.
If technology
Not
reaches that
impossible,
point, wouldn't
very
we be able to make a cure just as fast? I don't know, man. What the fuck are you asking? I don't fucking work for the CDC. I have no idea. I would say probably not, though, if it breaks out unexpectedly. Okay. That's enough doomsday scenarios for now, I think. Thanks for the gift sub, King Sloth. Yep, very familiar, Papa. Sure, Johnny.
In early 1959, a group of hikers decided to head out on an expedition across a mountainous region of Western Soviet Union. The group consisted of 9 experienced men and women, greatly familiar.
For the record, new information about Dyatlov has surfaced over the last few months.
Would prove to be their last. Despite a criminal investigation, photographs and journal entries, the case remains unsolved after more than half a century. This is the case of Dyatlov Pass.
Hey, thanks for the 5 gift subs, Spicy Meat. Fucking tier 3 and gift subs, man. Thank you. Thanks for the gift sub, Licked.
In the early morning of January the 23rd, 1959, a ski and hiking team of 10 boarded a train headed for the Ural Mountains in the middle of the Soviet Union. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women,
hey, Big T's, hope you're doing well.
Dyatlov as the group's leader. As the train slowly advanced deep into the mountainous Siberian taiga, the group diary received a final entry. I wonder what awaits us on this hike. Will anything new happen?
Oh,
over the next few days, the group continued to alternate between modes of transportation.
Red Rockstar.
First a bus, then a truck, then a horse and sleigh, and eventually they proceed on foot and skis. On January the 28th, one of the hikers named Yuri Yudin had begun to feel quite ill and eventually decided to head back, while the remaining group of 9 continued as planned. These photos were taken just before they parted ways, and it would be the last time he saw his friends alive. The group resumed their expedition across the snow-covered outback and documented everything of note using diaries as well as multiple cameras. Recovered photos and journal entries suggest that the trek progressed as one would expect, with no unforeseen complications. Just lots of snow, bitter cold, and an increasingly arduous landscape. On February the 1st, they reached the foot of a mountain known to the indigenous Mansi population as Dead Mountain. They spend the better part of the day progressing up the slope and eventually decide to set up camp only a few hundred meters from the peak.
Thanks for 5 gift subs, Extinct.
These are some of the last photos recovered from the cameras, and the last sentence of the final entry reads, "It is difficult to imagine such a comfort on the ridge, with shrill, howling wind hundreds of kilometers away from human settlements."
This one shows bodies. Let me do a quick scan. I mean, I'm sure... Oh, yeah. There's a whole section called The Bodies. When we get to that chapter, I'll just go ahead and play it safe. I won't show that chapter. I'll just let you hear the audio.
A few weeks later, friends and relatives begin to worry. No one has heard from Igor or any of the other members of the group. After much debate, a team of volunteers eventually head out to find them. On February the 26th, the search party is finally able to locate the camp on the slope. It's obvious to the first at the scene that something has gone horribly wrong. The tent is in scrambles, covered by a thin coat of snow. The hikers' belongings and equipment was found orderly placed inside the tent, but the tent itself had been slashed open with a knife from the inside.
Whoa.
The next day, 9 pairs of footprints lead the search volunteers down the slope towards the nearby woods. Given that the footprints left rather mild indentations in the snow, would suggest that they descended the slope in a rather calm and orderly fashion, as opposed to running away in panic. The footprints could be tracked for about half a kilometer from the tent until the trail was completely covered by snow. So they continued in the direction of the trail and under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, next to the remains of an improvised campfire. They found the frozen bodies.
Alright, let's just not take any chances.
Of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonoshenko. It would take over
Thanks to
2
Prime
months
squirting.
for the bodies of all 9 hikers to be recovered. The first 2 were found severely underdressed. No jackets, no pants, no gloves, hats, boots or anything else one might expect given the frigid climate. Only light shirts, underpants and socks. At the time of their death it would have been around 30 degrees below zero. The cedar tree had signs of damage as if someone had climbed it, with branches broken up to 5 meters high. Perhaps they were attempting to locate a tent in the pitch black
Yeah, I know
darkness,
XQC watch
or
that I saw. That's
perhaps
like
they
one of the
were
first
trying
things
to
that comes
hide
up when you
from
type in
someone
Dyatlov.
or something. The next 3 hikers were found at varying distances between the tent and the tree, covered by a few centimeters of snow. They were better dressed than the previous 2, but not by much, as they still lacked essential items
Thanks
such
to
as
Resub
boots,
Key and
hats,
Robert.
and gloves. They were all found facing the direction of the tent as if they were struggling to return
It's for
at
Twitch.
the moment
I'm not
of
taking a
death.
chance.
While some of them had sustained minor injuries, all 5 had died of hypothermia. It should also be noted that 4 of them had died while intoxicated. The last 4 hikers were found at the bottom of a small hill, covered by 3 meters of snow, 75 meters from the tree.
Again, a
in
lot
the
has come out
opposite
about this
direction
over the last
of
few
tent.
months from what I remember.
3 of them had sustained lethal injuries. 1 had a fractured skull, and 2 had fractured multiple ribs and suffered massive internal bleeding.
Thanks to Prime Squanch.
The medical examiner believed the injuries had been sustained from a fall and compared it to a car crash. The injuries had been sustained while they were all alive and could not have been inflicted by another person. 2 had also been found with gaping eye sockets, and 1 of the
Jesus.
women had a missing tongue. The last of the 4 had a
What?
broken nose and a deformed neck, but died of hypothermia. The most mysterious of all, 3 articles of clothing were later found to be abnormally radioactive. On May the 28th, the criminal case was discontinued
What?
with a cryptic and incredibly vague conclusion.
Okay, I think
The
that's
lead
it.
investigator writes in the final report, "The cause of death was an unknown compelling force,
Actually,
which
hold
the
on.
hikers
Let me
were
double
unable."
check before I let it ride uninterrupted. Yeah, it seems to be the only time they show the bodies. Next is just campsites and stuff. Real quick though, again, I'm gonna double check, but I'm pretty sure there was a huge Dyatlov Pass breakthrough recently. Yeah. I remember it was kind of big on Reddit, so that was a couple months ago. Yeah, I believe, I won't spoil it. Well, this kind of spoils it. But yeah, you know.
To overcome. Not exactly the most satisfying answer and barely a conclusion at all. So,
Thanks to
just
resub,
in case the
Bloopy
Galactic
and
Empire
Luffy.
had nothing to do with the death
The
of the
Prime
hikers,
Tuki.
is it possible to explain some of the more enigmatic details in a less vague yet credible fashion? Let's give it a shot. The fact that Dubinina was missing her tongue has been taken way out of proportion. Some say that it was cut off or ripped out while she was still alive. Others say it was eaten by scavengers after death, while some even claim the tongue was later found somewhere else. But I've read the medical reports and this is what it says. The diaphragm of the mouth and the tongue is missing. That's it. There's nothing about cutting or ripping or anything. I don't know how or where it began, but there seems to be an exaggerated importance placed on this missing tongue, while in reality, it's a rather minor detail. At least the medical examiner believed it to be a minor detail, otherwise he would likely have elaborated further. For example, the same section of the same report states, "Gaping orbits, the eyeballs are absent." Equally mysterious, right? Well, no, because the medical examiner does provide an explanation for both. Soft tissue injuries to the head are post-mortem changes to Dubinina's corpse, which was recently exposed to water prior to detection. He even adds putrefaction and decomposition in parentheses to clarify exactly what he means. And this was not even exclusive to Dubinina, as the 4 last bodies were all damaged due to the melting snow. Now, some
Makes
claim
sense.
that her tongue must have been removed while she was
can we
still
really rule
alive,
out Sasquatch?
and pointed to the fact that she had about 100 grams of blood in her stomach. But that's not exactly true either. The relevant portion of the forensic examination reads, the stomach contained up to 100 cubic centimeters of a dark red, slimy mass. That's about 10 centiliters of something, most likely food, mixed with something red, most likely blood. So we don't know how much blood was in her stomach, just that there was blood in her stomach. Which isn't that strange, given that she was suffering from massive internal bleeding. One of the most mysterious aspects of this case is that 3 separate articles of clothing discovered on 2 of the bodies were found to be radioactive, which does indeed sound a bit mysterious, but you have to keep in mind that almost everything is slightly radioactive. So we need more details.
True.
The radiological studies claim that under normal circumstances, an area of 150 square centimeters should not exceed 5,000 disintegrations.
Everything is radioactive, literally
Only
everything.
3 articles of clothing exceeded or equaled that limit at 5,000
They were
DPM,
fucking nuked. Yeah, that's probably what it
DPM,
was.
and 9,900 DPM. The only explanation given in the report is that the clothes were contaminated as radioactive dust fell from the atmosphere, or the clothes were susceptible to contamination when in contact with radioactive substances. In other words, they were unable to determine exactly how the clothes were contaminated, but it's not unrealistic to believe it to be a result of natural processes.
Not really
But
before we
just
made
in
nukes,
case
FYI.
It wasn't due to the elements. There may
Bro,
be
you're just
an
outright
alternative
wrong. Wait, what?
explanation. Kolevatov had previously worked at a facility
You think
developing
nukes made
nuclear
radiation?
materials, and Krivonoshenko had previously worked at a top-secret plutonium production plant for nuclear weapons, and the 3 articles of radioactive clothing belonged to Kolevatov and Krivonoshenko. Around the time of the hiker's disappearance, numerous sources claim to have seen UFOs in the form of orbs of light moving across the night sky for a few seconds up to several minutes. These include 3 soldiers and 2 different hiking groups. Some witnesses also claim that the indigenous Mansi population, as well as a group of geologists, had told them that they had observed fireballs in the sky around the time of the incident. The problem with UFO sightings is that they are, well, unidentified and often unverifiable as a result.
Which means they have to be
true. One of the hiking groups reported to have seen the UFO during the night of the incident, while the other sightings occurred before or after. Then there's this. This is the very last photo taken with one of the hiker's cameras. It appears to be a photo of some type of light source taken in the middle of the night.
What if it actually is aliens?
The photo is about as undescriptive as the UFO it is claimed to depict. It could no doubt be a photo of a UFO, and it could no doubt be a photo of a candle, flashlight, fire, stove, or anything else. But let's assume that it is a photo of something in the night sky. What could it potentially be depicting? I can think of a few possibilities. A rocket, a piece of a rocket, man-made space debris during re-entry, a crashing aircraft, or perhaps a meteor. None of which would be too surprising given that this is the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War as well as the space race, so there would have been a lot of aerial activity. At a time when space exploration was about as fresh as a prince living in an affluent LA neighborhood, it's not surprising that people were unable to identify the mysterious lights. Regardless, it could not have landed close to the hikers as it would have been found by the search teams. And if the object had already been recovered...
Why do you keep fucking spamming this? Last story was Nightblood. Valentina had Nightblood and she didn't die from radiation. What the fuck is Nightblood? What the fuck are you talking about? Is it like a CW show or something? What is Nightblood? You've been spamming that for almost 40 minutes now since we finished that. And Valentina never died. It's actually fanfic. You have been spamming about fanfic. Is this your fanfic? Well, that was a good waste of time.
have been evidence in the form of a crash site, footprints, and other activity on the ground. So, given the fact that there is no obvious connection between the UFO and the hiker's disappearance,
of
I
JF
put
and
this in
Fiani
the
and the
spooky
Prime
red
Dwarf.
herring box. So, what happened? Why did they leave the tent? Why was it slashed open from the inside? How did some of them sustain such major injuries while the others simply succumbed to the cold? Why were so many of them underdressed? I
Avalanche.
think the biggest mystery is how it's been able to remain a mystery given the abundance of information. So after spending the better part of this month hiring multiple Russian translators reading through a massive amount of material ranging from theories about a KGB cover-up to a simple avalanche accident, this is what I believe to be the most credible.
Let's see if he gets it right, because there is an explanation now.
First of all, why would they leave the tent? That seems to be the most important missing piece of the puzzle. I would argue that the only thing that could make them leave would have to be an immediate threat inside the tent. If something was outside, such as an animal or a UFO, then there would be no reason to cut the tent open. There were no signs of an avalanche, however, they could have escaped believing an avalanche was tumbling towards them. The problem with that theory is that the footprints show them walking in a calm and orderly manner down the slope, as opposed to running away in panic. So something caused them to panic inside the tent, but once outside, they calmed down and made a conscious decision to walk down the slope. Now, take a look at this photo. The pipe sticking out of the tent entrance is the exhaust pipe of the internal stove. This was a completely unique and homemade design, as the leader of the group had built the stove himself. We know they had used the stove on the night of the incident before the incident took place, as partially eaten pieces of fried ham and bacon were found inside the tent. I think that after disassembling the stove and removing the exhaust pipe, the embers inside the stove were accidentally reignited. As the exhaust pipe had been removed, the smoke would have filled the tent in seconds. As they attempted to get control of the flame, they cut a few holes at the top of the tent to vent the smoke.
Damn, this guy's
When
a
that didn't
genius.
work and it became increasingly difficult to breathe, the side of the tent was slashed open and they all escaped in a state of panic. There's even more evidence to support this theory. Several members of the group were found with burn marks on both their bodies and
Hold on, just in case they show bodies, not gonna risk it.
which could definitely have been a result of the improvised fire under the tree, or perhaps a scalding hot metal stove. Some of them were also found with blood around their mouth, and coughing up blood could be a symptom of smoke inhalation. Then there's this photo, taken the day before the incident. The jacket has obviously been burned, but the question is how? It's possible that sparks from the stove had accidentally set the jacket aflame. Okay, so they make it outside and quickly realize what a terrible situation
Thanks to
they're
give some
in.
Shane and the big
Sub-zero
2-2 Kid
temperatures,
Freud.
no shelter, underdressed, in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. At
Happy
this point, I
21st
think
birthday,
one
take
or
a
more
hint.
of them made a decision to
Happy
head for
birthday.
the nearest shelter, which they would have known to be the woods. The reasoning behind this decision is likely multifaceted. The smoke from the tent could have made it impossible to stay within its proximity, and/or the smoke may have caused them to believe that the tent was on fire. Some of them were intoxicated, which could have affected their judgment as well as their sensibility to the cold. And they may also have believed to be closer to the woods than they actually were. So they finally reached the woods and immediately set out to make a fire. Some climbed a tree and scavenged the surrounding area, while those who are more properly dressed head a bit deeper into the woods. About 75 meters from the tree, 4 of them trigger a minor avalanche, taking them over the edge of a ravine with a drop of about 3 meters. As the bottom is filled with rocks and ice, they sustain lethal injuries. 3 of the other 5 hikers decide to head back for the tent, while the remaining 2 slowly freeze to death around a fading flame.
So, that theory makes a ton of sense, and I haven't kept up with the Dyatlov discoveries here, but like I said, I remembered recently there was a huge resurgence in information and explanations for this, so let me just check to make sure there's no pictures of bodies. Just ripped some good ass in case you heard that. Okay, this looks good. So this comes from Smithsonian Mag. Thanks to the resub raw. Can't say I've done that before, dried pickle. Thanks to the resub bravo. Alright, let's see. This is just an overview. Oh, here we go. An abominable snowman attack. That seems like a cool theory. We do not claim to have solved the Dyatlov Pass mystery, as no one survived to tell the story. That's just what a man who solved the mystery would say, being very coy. But we show the plausibility of the avalanche hypothesis. An avalanche, a snow slab, or a hurricane. Thanks to Tier 1 Zion and Prime Huso. Official findings suggested a torrent of snow slabs or blocky chunks surprised the sleeping victims and pushed them to seek shelter at a nearby ridge. Unable to see more than 50 feet ahead, the hikers froze to death as they attempted to make their way back to their tent. Critics of the slab avalanche theory cite four main counter-arguments: the lack of physical traces of an avalanche, more than 9-hour gap between the hikers building their camp, a process that required cutting into the mountain to form a barrier against the wind, and their panicked departure, the shallow slope of the campsite, and the traumatic injuries sustained by the group. Asphyxiation is more common cause of death for avalanche victims. Okay. So this guy proved that a snow slab could have wiped through the area without leaving many traces. A slab avalanche, excuse me. Alright. Jesus, they really went in on this. Got a whole little fucking graph. Well, not graph, a whole little picture. Researchers unraveled the final piece of the puzzle, the hikers' unexplained injuries, with the help of a surprising source, Disney's 2013 film Frozen. I'm starting to doubt how accurate this conclusion may be. If Elsa did it, but I'll continue. He was so impressed by the movie's depiction of snow that he asked his creators to share their animation code with him. This simulation tool, coupled with data from cadaver tests conducted by General Motors in 1970 to determine what would happen to the human body when struck at different speeds, enabled the pair to show that heavy blocks of solid snow could have landed on the hikers as they slept, crushing their bones and causing injuries not typically associated with avalanches. If this was the case, the pair posits those who had sustained less serious blows likely dragged their injured companions out of the tent in the hopes of saving their lives. Okay. Thanks to the resub remark. The slabs of snow would have had to be incredibly stiff and moving at a significant speed to inflict such violent injuries. He adds that the research doesn't explain why these people, after being hit by an avalanche, ran off without their clothes into the snow. True. If you're in that type of harsh environment, it's suicide to leave shelter without your clothes on. True. For people to do that, they must have been terrified by something, and I assume one of the most likely things is one of them went crazy for some reason. Can't understand why else they would have behaved in that way unless they were trying to flee from someone who's been tracking them. I mean, yeah. I guess that really wasn't as conclusive as I thought it would be. Thanks to Prime Darko and Resub Prime. Oh, DB Cooper. Yes, I didn't even think of that. Maybe it was DB Cooper. Don't know if I've seen that one yet either. To be honest, LEMMiNO's theory actually sounds more plausible. This, I'm doubting that one now. Let me just double check there's no bodies here. Now I'm interested. Yeah, no bodies. Is it not just hypothermic psychosis? Well, no, because it all happened while they were in their tents warm, supposedly. They cut out of the tent and all took off into the night. They wouldn't be suffering from hypothermia inside with a stove and clothing and everything. That really wouldn't add up. Oh no, this one also talks about slab avalanche. And it also cites Frozen. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows? That is very interesting. Very interesting indeed. But
Just let me know.
fuck it, we'll go in.
Near the end of the 16th
Thanks
century,
to Prime Pony.
a man by the name of John White embarked on a transatlantic voyage. His destination
Prime
was the
Dustin.
island of Roanoke along the southeastern coast of North America. On this island, White had established an English colony some 3 years before, and he was now returning to resume his
Thanks to
position as
LEMMiNO.
governor. After a long and difficult journey, White finally reached the site of the colony, only to find the more than
Prime
100
Pyro.
men, women and children he'd left behind had disappeared. A secret message carved into a tree was one of the only clues left behind at the scene. Before White had a chance to conduct a more extensive search, the ship returned to England, and in its wake, it left a mystery. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke?
I think I know the conclusion, so I'm just gonna say it. I don't remember if this is right since it's been so long, and I actually haven't watched this video.
Before
I was
we
wrong.
can tackle the
I-
lost
if I
colony,
remember
we
correctly,
first
they
need to
just
understand
left.
the events leading up to its disappearance.
They literally just
The
left.
story begins in 1584 when two ships sailed across the Atlantic to scout for a suitable location for the planting of the first permanent English colony.
Makes a tier 1
in
bunch of eggs in the tier 1
In
mayo.
mid-July, they made landfall
prime
on a
dunt
string of
and
barrier islands
enjoyable
known as the
cactus.
Outer Banks. The English quickly developed friendly relations with the local Native Americans and were soon invited to their village on Roanoke Island. After about a month, the scouting expedition returned to their ships and sailed back to England. Upon the expedition's return in late September, the man in charge of the enterprise, Walter Raleigh, immediately began preparations to plant a permanent colony somewhere along the Outer Banks. Raleigh was soon thereafter knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, and the new land was to be named Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen. In April of 1585, a fleet of 7 ships departed England with a complement of roughly 600 men and loaded with enough provisions to sustain the colony for about a year. The fleet reached the Outer Banks at the end of June, but was soon faced with
I know
crisis.
nothing about it.
Navigating the waters of the Outer Banks can be notoriously treacherous, as indicated by these sinking ships. And when the flagship passed through one of the shallow inlets, it struck a shoal and was nearly destroyed. As the flagship carried the bulk of the provisions and most of it was now spoiled by seawater, the scope of the colony had to be dramatically reduced. About 100 men, far fewer than initially intended, were stationed on Roanoke Island, and with the natives' approval, they began construction of what was to become the Roanoke colony. The island was primarily chosen for its strategic value. It provided quick access to the ocean while still making the colony invisible to Spanish patrols. You see, Spain had already colonized and laid claim to much of what the English now called Virginia, so they had to be careful.
Old war shit is so fucking cool to me.
A second wave of supplies and reinforcements was expected
Hey,
to
Abrasive,
arrive
thank you for the
before
20
the
gift subs
winter,
again,
but
Abrasive.
unbeknownst to the colonists,
Thank
the
you, Abrasive. I
resupply
hope you've
mission
been
had
well.
been countermanded by the Queen to deal with more pressing concerns back in England. As such, once the colonists ran out of food, they had to rely on the generosity of the natives.
Appreciate the fat drop
However,
as
the
always.
natives
Thank you,
only
Abrasive.
had so much to spare and struggled to meet increasing demands by the colonists. This overdependence quickly began to strain their relationship. Meanwhile, people had begun to notice a disturbing trend. Every time the English visited a Native American village, many of its inhabitants would inexplicably collapse and die. The natives believed the English could kill from a distance by shooting invisible bullets, and they were not too far off. While unknown at the time, the English were carrying deadly pathogens to which the natives lacked immunity, and thus an epidemic was unwittingly unleashed upon the indigenous population. The two leaders back on Roanoke, Colonial Governor Rolfe Lane and Indian Chieftain Wingina, eventually grew so suspicious of one another that cohabitation was no longer possible. Wingina decided to remove his people from the island and retreated to a larger village on the mainland. Meanwhile, Lane came to believe that Wingina had formed an alliance with other tribes and that they were plotting to launch an attack against the colony. Whether he was paranoid or not, Lane decided to take preemptive action. On the 1st of June, 1586, Lane and his men made their way to the mainland village.
No, I'm pretty sure it has a real explanation. I think they just moved. They literally
One of the
left.
Englishmen chased after and decapitated Wingina, and his head was later impaled outside a fort
Holy
of
shit.
the colony. A week later, a large English fleet commanded by the renowned sea captain Sir Francis Drake dropped by the Outer Banks on its way back to England. Given the lack of food and violent clashes with the natives, it was decided to abandon the colony. The colonists were hastily evacuated off the island, and then after 9 long months, they all returned home. All except 3 who were not located in time for the evacuation, and so the fleet left them behind. They were never heard from again. If the scouting expedition of 1584 had been a resounding success, the colony of 1585 was a categorical failure. Relations with the Native Americans had completely fallen apart, the severe lack of food had made life miserable, and they had failed to track down rumored sources of gold and copper which could have made the venture worthwhile. In spite of all this, at least one man
But at least they found friends.
His name was John White. White was a painter and artist
Thanks for some
by trade,
Tiger
and many
and
of the maps and
Chakrosis and the
sketches
Prime
that we've seen
Pseudo.
so far were either drawn by him or based on his work. Somewhat ironically, however, there are no surviving portraits of White himself. White's participation in these earlier voyages is slightly ambiguous. He may have been part of the scouting expedition in 1584, but he was definitely part of the voyage in 85. What is a bit unclear is whether he stayed behind at the colony or returned to England with the outbound fleet. For instance, White's name is not included in a surviving list of all the colonists. But some historians believe this is merely an oversight and that he was in fact part of the colony. In either case, Sir Walter Raleigh was eventually persuaded by White and others to attempt a second venture. Unlike the first colony, which had been more...
What if Roanoke grew so advanced that they actually were able to build teleportation and teleport it out?
White's pregnant daughter,
is that a potential
Eleanor
theory?
Dare. After a long struggle to secure the necessary funding, a fleet of 3 ships commanded by White, who would also serve as the governor of the colony, departed England in late spring of 1587.
Thanks to the gift sub Kingo-so and the resub Senpai. Thanks for a long time of watching.
The misfortune of the first colony did not end with its evacuation in 1586. Only days later, a ship filled with provisions sent by Sir Walter Raleigh arrived at the Outer Banks. The crew spent some time searching for the colonists, but when they found no sign of them,
scary adventure going from place to place on the sea like that.
Home. The same thing happened 2 weeks later when an English-bound fleet loaded with supplies and reinforcements also found the colony deserted. Unwilling to leave the colony vacant, however, the captain left 15 crewmen on Roanoke before the fleet resumed course for England. John White had been told about the 15 crewmen before he departed, so when his fleet approached the Outer Banks in late July of 1587, he intended to pay them a visit. But this is where things get confusing. You see, the second colony was never intended to be established on Roanoke. After all, the long list of complications encountered by the first colony made it clear that Roanoke was far from an ideal location. Instead, the second colony, or the city of Raleigh as the man in charge had so immodestly named it, was to be planted somewhere along the coast of Chesapeake Bay. This made a lot more sense. The water was deeper to allow for larger ships and not nearly as precarious as those around the outer banks. There was plenty of open space, the soil was more fertile, and all around it seemed an improvement to Roanoke Island. But the fleet's Portuguese navigator, Simão Fernandes, had other plans. Fernandes had also been the navigator of the two previous expeditions and was a far more experienced sailor than White.
How does this all tie into Roanoke, though? I'm a little confused.
It seems much of the crew respected the authority of Fernandes. As such, when Fernandes decided to ignore the plan about Chesapeake Bay and instead simply dump the colonists on Roanoke, White did nothing to challenge his decision. The rest of the crew quickly fell in line, and soon enough everyone disembarked for Roanoke. Upon reaching the abandoned colony, there was no sign of the 15 crewmen they had come to assist. Instead, they found a pile of bones that appeared to be the remains of one of them.
Nice, they ate them.
White suspected the men had been attacked by vengeful Indians, and any doubts he might have had were soon to be raised. After only a few days on the island, a colonist by the name of George Howe was attacked by a group of natives who pelted him with 16 arrows before caving in his skull with a wooden club.
Wow.
A brutal yet unmistakable message. The English were no longer welcome on Roanoke. Even so, the colonists were not without allies. You see, when the scouting expedition returned to England in 1584, two Native Americans named Wanchese and Manteo were brought along with them. Wanchese was from Roanoke, while Manteo was from a neighboring village on the island of Croatoan. When they were finally brought back to North America in 1585, they had developed vastly different opinions of the English people. As soon as they made landfall, Wanchese returned to Roanoke with nothing but resentment for these foreign invaders. Meanwhile, Manteo was fascinated by everything the English had to offer. He became their trusted guide and a mediator of sorts to
they had like technology and shit, right?
First contact. So, following the death of George Howe, White reached out to the Croatoans, and they confirmed what he'd initially suspected. A large group of Indian tribes had indeed attacked the 15 crewmen stationed on Roanoke. This coalition was spearheaded by none other than Wanchese. At least
that
2
bastard
of the crewmen had been killed in the attack, while the rest escaped in a small boat, never to be seen again. Roanoke had become a much more dangerous place to live. Simão Fernandes remained anchored near the Outer Banks for about a month before he decided to return to England. In the meantime, the colonists had grown concerned about the long-term survival of the colony. If the colony were to be truly self-sufficient, they argued, they would require more people and more food.
And a nuclear reactor.
They implored Governor White to return to England with Fernandes so that he could bring back supplies and restock the colony. White was initially hesitant to leave as he feared he'd be accused of desertion if he returned to England alone. Not to mention he would have to abandon his daughter, who had recently given birth to a daughter of her own, named Virginia, on this remote and precarious island. But in time, he was persuaded to go, and as the fleet departed in late August of 1587, he could not have known he would never see any of them again.
Oh no. The Kraken got him, huh? We live in such a fucking boring world.
After a long and difficult voyage,
I wish it was something like a fucking Elder God Cthulhu was the one like behind all of it.
No ships were to leave England until the threat of a Spanish invasion had passed. This was bad news for White, and his best efforts notwithstanding, he remained trapped in England for 3 long years. It was not until the spring of 1590, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, that White finally managed to book passage on a convoy bound for America. Upon reaching the Outer Banks,
I haven't seen that, but that sounds scary, Sleepy.
Plumes of smoke appeared to emanate from Roanoke Island. 2 boats were quickly dispatched, and the crew fired the ship's cannons to make their presence known. The men could see a great fire as they approached the island, but White never clarifies whether it was natural or lit by people. Once ashore, they made their way to the west end of the island
Appreciate
and
it,
found a set
Dustin.
of footprints. They appear to be fresh,
Don't know what that means, but thanks,
there was
Omni.
no sign of those to whom they belonged. The search party then headed north and happened upon a tree where someone had carved the letters C-R-O. Upon reaching the entrance of the colony, they came across a second inscription. It was the word Croatoan engraved into a wooden post. The post was but one of many that now formed a defensive barrier around the colony. The colony itself was deserted, and clearly had been for some time, given the overgrowth of grass and weeds. The houses had been taken down and stripped of valuables. All they found were bars of iron, a few cannons, as well as 5
Iron's valuable.
chests. There
Thanks
was
for
no
5 new
trace
subs,
of the
handy
roughly
dandy.
115 colonists,
Appreciate the
nor
generosity,
the small
thank you.
boats left in their possession. As far as anyone could tell, no one had lived here for quite some time. The story of the lost colony is often centered around the 2 engravings, and without the full context, it's easy to see how an author might imbue these inscriptions with intrigue and mystery. In truth, the carvings are some of the more well-understood elements of
And
the
thank you for the 5
entire
new subs,
story.
Elgato, and the
At
tier 1
least John
Sleepy.
White had no doubts about their meaning. White explains in his notes
you,
that
Gato.
before he left in 1587, he and the colonists had come to an agreement. If they decided to abandon the colony before the governor's return, they were to leave behind a secret token of their destination. Furthermore, if this abandonment was forced upon them, they were to include a cross to signify distress. Because no such cross had been found, White was confident the colonists had safely relocated to the island of Croatoan.
I fucking
Thus,
told you,
White
yeah.
swiftly returned to the ship and convinced the captain to set course for Croatoan. But while the crew prepared for departure, the anchor cable snapped, and without the spare anchor, the captain felt it was too dangerous to continue. In the end, White never made it to Croatoan, and it was the last time he ever ventured across the Atlantic.
Yeah, they literally just fucking left. Oh yeah, this place sucks, I'm out.
While an unsatisfying conclusion, it seems relatively safe to assume the lost colony of Roanoke simply relocated to the island of Croatoan. Case closed?
Not sure, Dead Alarm. There's a lot of cool history.
Not quite. You see, while explaining the meaning of the inscriptions, White revealed another interesting yet puzzling detail. With a single sentence, White explains that before he left in 1587, the colonists were preparing to move 50 miles into the mainland. While Croatoan is about 50 miles south of Roanoke, it's also an island, distinctly not part of the mainland. As such, this lone sentence introduces, if but a modicum of doubt, to White's version of events.
Thanks to Prime Thief and
Perhaps
Resub Heretic.
Croatoan was not their intended destination after all. If so, where could they have gone? "20 years after the Roanoke colony was lost, the Anglo-Spanish War had come to an
Thanks to
end.
Prime Sealy.
John White faded into obscurity, and Sir Walter Raleigh had been found guilty of treason for conspiring against the crown. Yeah, I know, it's a whole other thing. Anyway, renewed interest in America saw the plantation of a third colony in 1607. The Jamestown colony was established within the borders of a vast confederacy of Native American tribes ruled by a man the English called Powhatan. One day, Powhatan captured the future governor of the colony, John Smith, and told him about
What a
the place where
fucking
a man
awful
wearing
name.
European clothing lived. Then, after his release in 1608, Smith drew a rough map of Virginia, and this is one of the notations. Unfortunately, this claim and others just like it were never properly investigated, so we can never know if this was anything more than a rumor. Another unconfirmed report was that all but a few of the colonists had been massacred by Powhatan.
5K
The
bits,
survivors
Rob.
of this
Jesus.
slaughter
No, I
at
haven't.
Roanoke
Well,
had
actually, I have.
supposedly scattered
It's a
across
show.
the region. The problem is, White did not report any human remains or signs of a battle when he returned to Roanoke in
Thank you, Rob.
1590. Even so, an acquaintance of John Smith later wrote that Powhatan had confessed to the massacre after Smith was captured. Smith himself, however, makes no mention of this alleged confession, and he was not exactly known to shy away from embellishment. Pocahontas. Other reports included sightings of Native American children with unusually pale skin and blonde hair, which led many to suspect they could be the descendants of the lost colonists. What they had no way of knowing at the time, however, was that albinism is far more prevalent among Native Americans than Europeans. A more solid lead emerged a full century later when the English explorer John Lawson made contact with a tribe known as the Hatteras. The Hatteras occupied the same land as the Croatoans, but the island was now much larger and known as Hatteras Island after a storm had closed one of the inlets. The Hatteras explained to Lawson that some of their ancestors had been white and able to read. Several members of the tribe also had gray eyes, a unique trait of the Hatteras according to Lawson. They also spoke of a local legend about a ghost ship which they referred to as Sir Walter Raleigh's ship.
Whoa!
Lawson grew convinced the Hatteras was in fact the descendants of the lost colony. Much like John White, Lawson believed the colony had been relocated to Croatoan, and over time the two peoples had become one. Okay, so we now have two sources over a century apart arguing for the same version of events. John White says they went to Croatoan because carvings. John Lawson says they went to Croatoan because grey eyes and ghosts. Not the most decisive evidence perhaps, but it does make for a compelling argument. Following Lawson's encounter with the Hatteras in 1701, nothing of significance would be uncovered for centuries. That is until the late 1930s when a series of peculiar stones suddenly brought the mystery back to life.
Whoa,
the stones had been inscribed with messages supposedly written by Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White. Unfortunately, they all turned out to be fake.
Oh,
well,
cool.
All except the first stone, whose authenticity remains in doubt. This stone features a message from Dare addressed to White in which she describes the tragic death of her husband and child. The composition of the stone makes it well suited for inscribing a message, but a poor choice for a forger, as they would have had to chemically age the fresh markings to match the weathered surface. It would not have been impossible, but quite difficult to do so in the 1930s.
Why would they bother forging that shit in the first place?
The stone was never heard from again, and the precise location of its discovery was conveniently kept secret. The credibility of the writing is equally contested, and there's just no consensus on what to make of it. Modern archaeological research has also been plagued by uncertainties. Excavations at Roanoke have mostly confirmed the presence of a 16th century English colony, but have done little in the way of determining its fate. Meanwhile, excavations on Hatteras has yielded a mix of Native American and European artifacts, including the hilt of a light sword, but nothing that can be definitively linked to the lost colony. To make matters worse, much of the evidence may now be underwater due to centuries of shifting sands and erosion of the islands.
Damn, time is fucking crazy.
It was partially out of frustration for this lack of progress that researchers made a remarkable discovery in late 2011. While inspecting,
turns out the colonists are still alive.
A member of the first colony
they discovered immortality.
Took note of these patches. Historically, patches like these have been used to correct minor mistakes, so no one had ever given them a second thought. This time, someone did and had the patches carefully examined. Underneath the lower patch, they found exactly what you'd expect: minor corrections. Underneath the upper patch, however, they found this.
Siemens.
This four-pointed star is a typical representation of a fort. A comparable symbol can be seen on this map from the early 17th century. The paint used to draw the symbol matches the paint used elsewhere on the map, including the corrections drawn on top of the lower patch, suggesting it was drawn and concealed by White himself.
Whoa.
More puzzling still, a slightly smaller four-pointed star enclosed by two concentric squares has been painted with invisible ink on top of the patch. This symbol can even be faintly discerned with the naked eye, meaning it's been hiding in plain sight all along. Finally, this fort is situated on the mainland,
but what does it all
50
mean?
miles west of Roanoke.
Are the colonists among us now? Jesus Christ.
The location of the concealed fort was quickly named Site X in reference to the expression X marks the spot.
Nice.
While the fort itself
Pretty
has
cool.
yet to be found, presuming it was ever built, archaeological digs have uncovered a few items of interest. Fragments of pottery
Hey, I know his
and
channel
bits of
very well,
metal
King Oso.
are indicative of an English presence, but much like the findings on Hatteras, an indisputable link to the lost colony has yet to be established.
God damn, thank you again, Rob.
That being said, the research is still ongoing, and the smoking gun, whatever it may be, will perhaps
can do
have
that
been
next.
found by the time you're watching this. Presuming this is the intended location for the city of
Thank
Raleigh,
you, Rob.
one
Thanks to
has to
resub
wonder,
Rubhub.
why was it concealed with a patch? Tempting as it may be to envision some elaborate conspiracy, there is a very simple explanation. Remember how in 1608 John Smith sent his rough map of Virginia
Yes, how
back
could I
to
forget
England?
1608?
Well, this is not the original map, but an illicit copy. A copy made in secret by the Spanish ambassador and covertly passed along to the King of Spain. So England had good reason to worry about sensitive information, such as the location of a fort, being intercepted by enemy spies. Another example is how the colony on Roanoke was concealed through omission. We still don't know the precise location or layout of the colony because it was never indicated on any of the surviving maps. While it continues
What do you mean? I was
to be
looking right at it.
information among historians and archaeologists, this secrecy did serve a purpose as it prevented Spain from ever finding the colony. In fact, Spain continued to search for the colony long after it was lost, so it's unlikely they had anything
Thanks
to
again,
do with its
Potato and Prime
disappearance.
Vengeful.
On the other hand, if the fort was never built,
Good point,
the patch
Omni.
may be precisely what it was always assumed to be, nothing more than a correction. Then again, the near invisible symbol drawn on top of the patch strongly imply concealment as opposed to a simple revision. After going through all the available evidence, this is what I'm thinking. So John White left Roanoke in 1587.
Right.
When he failed to return, the colony was split into two groups. One decamped for Site X, while the other went to live with the friendly Croatoans to await the governor's return.
Oh,
The region is
interesting.
known to have suffered a severe drought just after White left, so the relocation may not only have been motivated by diminishing supplies and hostilities, but also
Maybe
by a
another night,
lack of
comrade.
water and crop production.
It's
As
getting late,
years
no more
turned
rabbit
into
holes.
decades, the colonists may have
I'm already
started
deep in
families
one.
with, and thus become inseparable from, the indigenous people amongst whom they lived. Not only would this explain the disappearance, but also the Croatoan inscription, the 50 miles into the main, as well as the grey eyes of the Hatteras. While I'm still leaning towards it being fake, I do find it interesting how the Dare stone was supposedly discovered just a few miles north of Site X. After all, if you're a hoaxer and you want to convince 1930s America that this stone is genuine, why claim you found it so far away from Roanoke? One should also keep in mind that much of the evidence relies solely on the words and paintings of one man. Parts of White's account could easily be a misinterpretation or exaggeration, so depending on what evidence you regard as credible, other solutions are equally plausible. For instance, some believe the colony went ahead with the original plan and relocated somewhere along the coast of Chesapeake Bay. Others believe they were all lost at sea after a failed attempt to return to England. But these solutions are about as helpful as saying the colony vanished into thin air. Without a more localized place of interest to search for corroborating evidence, there is virtually no hope of resolution. So, with all that being said, many questions remain. What happened to the 3 forsaken colonists and the 13 crewmen? Why did Simão Fernandes disobey orders and dump the colonists on Roanoke? Why was one of the 2 engravings left incomplete? Why was everyone named John? As for the most important question of them all, well, if there is an answer to that question, chances are it lies buried somewhere at Site X, just waiting to be found.
Damn. I think his theory makes the most sense. They split into groups and they both went to 2 different places. I think that is the most likely. But I like to imagine there's a more paranormal element at play. I think what also could have happened is perhaps a dimensional rift had occurred at some point, maybe due to an intense weather anomaly. And through that rift entered one of the Lovecraftian villains we just recently learned about, and that is what happened. Thanks to Prime Weathers. And I can't be proven wrong yet, but I eventually will, I think.